The flight that changed everything. Marcus Long, a self-made millionaire, had never been one to boast about his success. Raised in a modest neighborhood, he had learned early in life that hard work, grit, and resilience were the keys to success. Today, he was returning from one of the biggest business deals of his life, a partnership that had the potential to change the course of his company's future. The deal was sealed, and the future seemed bright. He had achieved what many thought was impossible, and it felt like he was finally at the top of his game. Marcus was accustomed to the finer things in life, including private flights. He had always chosen to fly with this particular private airline, a company known for its comfort and discretion. Today, however, something felt different. As he arrived at the private terminal, the usual sense of calm was replaced by an unsettling feeling in the air. He could sense that something wasn't right. As he entered the terminal, a middle-aged man named Jack greeted him, but there was no warmth in his greeting, no familiar recognition in his voice. Instead, Jack's face wore an expression of skepticism and suspicion. "Are you sure you've booked this flight?" Jack asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "We don't often get clients like you." Marcus felt the sting of Jack's words, but he remained composed. He had faced similar situations before: racism, prejudice, and outright disregard for his accomplishments simply because of the color of his skin. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt personal. "I'm sure I have," Marcus replied calmly, offering his documents. "The flight was booked in advance by my company." Jack didn't even look at the papers in Marcus's hand. He glanced at them with visible distrust before muttering, "Wait here. I need to check everything." Marcus watched as Jack walked away, his footsteps heavy with judgment. The air around him grew thicker with tension, and Marcus felt the familiar sting of indignity creeping up his spine. He had always known that some people would never see beyond the color of his skin, but he had never expected it from a company he had used for years without issue. After what seemed like an eternity, Jack returned, accompanied by another employee, a woman named Kate. Kate looked him over from head to toe, her eyes scanning him with barely concealed disdain. Marcus had seen that look before, the look of someone who saw him as nothing more than an outsider, someone who didn't belong. "We checked your documents," Kate said, her voice laced with an air of superiority. "But to be honest, something doesn't seem right." She pretended to study his passport as if searching for some flaw, some reason to question his legitimacy. "This amount of money doesn't usually belong to people like you," she added, her tone barely masking her contempt. Marcus's blood began to boil. The casual racism, the assumption that he didn't belong, the mockery of his success. It was all too much. But he knew better than to react impulsively. He had spent his life learning to navigate these types of situations, and he wasn't about to let them break him. He took a deep breath, his voice calm but firm. "I often fly with your company. My documents are in order. The flight was booked by my company weeks ago." But his words fell on deaf ears. Jack and Kate exchanged a glance, their faces unreadable. It was clear they were not interested in hearing him out. "We can't allow just anyone to use our services," Jack finally said, his words dripping with disdain. "You have to understand that." Marcus was no fool. He knew what was happening. This wasn't about missing paperwork or a misunderstanding. This was about his race. This was about the fact that, in their eyes, a black man didn't deserve to be in their space, flying on their jet, paying for the luxury they offered. The tension in the air was palpable. The employees seemed oblivious to the weight of their actions, but Marcus knew all too well what this meant. They thought they could strip him of his dignity with their disdain, humiliate him in front of others, and send him away like he was some kind of imposter. But they didn't realize that their fates were already in his hands. Marcus stood there, his anger rising but carefully controlled. He had been through worse in his life. Far worse. He had built his wealth from the ground up, had fought tooth and nail to get to where he was. No one could take that away from him. Not now. Not ever. "I understand," Marcus said slowly, his voice steady. "But I think you're making a mistake." Jack and Kate didn't respond, and Marcus could see the suspicion still lingering in their eyes. It was as if they couldn't fathom that someone like him could afford the luxury they were offering. They couldn't see the hard work, the late nights, the sacrifices, and the endless determination that had gotten him to this point. Instead, they saw his skin, and that was all that mattered. "I'll just wait for the next flight then," Marcus said, turning to walk away, his mind already racing. He wasn't going to let this incident slide. He had been humiliated, yes, but he had learned long ago that the best way to fight back was not with violence or anger, but with strategy, with intelligence, and with perseverance. As he walked away from the counter, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. He knew he would never forget the condescending stares, the insults disguised as questions, and the blatant racism he had faced that day. But what the airline employees didn't know was that they had just made a grave mistake. They had underestimated Marcus Long, and they had no idea that, in that moment, their fates had already been sealed. What Marcus did next would shock them all. But before we get to that, let's take a closer look at the man behind the success. The man who, despite everything, refused to let anyone strip away his dignity. The unseen truths. Marcus Long had been through countless negotiations, high-stakes meetings, and intense situations that required an almost preternatural level of calm and focus. Yet nothing had prepared him for this moment. Standing in the sleek, sterile private terminal, he could feel the weight of Kate's gaze. She stood next to Jack, her expression one of calculated scrutiny. Marcus had been through this kind of thing before. People sizing him up, judging him before even knowing his name. But what happened next was an entirely new level of disrespect. Kate didn't even try to hide the disdain in her eyes as she glanced at Marcus's passport. It wasn't a simple inspection. It was as if she were searching for a flaw, a crack, anything that could justify her judgment. The silence between them stretched long, and Marcus could feel the tension building with every second that passed. Finally, she spoke, but her words were carefully chosen, coated with a thin layer of politeness that barely concealed the contempt beneath. "We check your documents, but to be honest, something doesn't seem right," she said, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "This amount of money doesn't usually belong to people like you." Her words stung, but Marcus knew how to handle moments like this. His entire life had been one long battle to prove that he was more than just the color of his skin, that his success wasn't some fluke or handout, that he had earned every dollar, every inch of progress, through blood, sweat, and determination. But instead of reacting with anger or frustration, Marcus kept his composure. He had learned long ago that losing his temper was a luxury he couldn't afford. Anger would only play into the hands of those who wanted to see him falter. Instead, he stood tall, locking eyes with Kate. The sharpness in his gaze was enough to make her falter, even if only for a second. "Perhaps your system is malfunctioning," Marcus said coolly. "But my flight was confirmed days ago. You can check again if you'd like. I have all the time in the world." The cold smile that crept onto Kate's face didn't escape Marcus. It was the smile of someone who knew they had the power and were willing to flaunt it. Jack, standing to the side, looked uncomfortable, but he didn't speak up. Instead, he nodded and gestured for Kate to continue her inspection. Kate's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she pretended to type, though her eyes were still on Marcus, scanning him as if he were some puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The silence stretched out again, this time more awkward than before. The tension in the room was palpable, and Marcus could feel the sweat gathering at the back of his neck. But he refused to show any sign of weakness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kate turned to Jack and said, "I think there's been a mistake. Your name doesn't match the usual clientele we serve." Jack hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do, but Kate's eyes were sharp and filled with authority. She gave him a look that silenced any objections. It was as if she had made up her mind, and there was nothing anyone could do to change it. "We'll have to ask you to leave," she added, her voice unyielding. "There's been an error with the booking." Marcus felt the sting of her words like a slap to the face. But even in the face of this blatant discrimination, he didn't flinch. He had been wronged, yes, but he knew that reacting out of emotion wouldn't serve him. Instead, he took a deep breath, slowly exhaling to calm himself. "You're making a mistake," he said softly, but firmly. "I'm supposed to be on that flight, and I have the right to be here." Kate's smile only widened, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was the smile of someone who knew they were in control and had no intention of letting go. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is beyond our control," she said with finality, her voice cold. "You'll have to find another way to travel." The finality in her tone made Marcus' blood boil, but he kept his temper in check. He knew this wasn't just about a flight. It was about something deeper, something more systemic. The way people like him, despite all their success, were still viewed as less than, still not worthy of the same respect as others. He took one last look at the two of them, feeling a mixture of disbelief and disgust. They thought they had the power to strip him of his dignity, to humiliate him in front of everyone in the terminal. But what they didn't realize was that they were about to make a mistake far greater than they could ever imagine. With a calmness that belied the rage building inside him, Marcus turned on his heel and walked out of the terminal. As he stepped into the cool air outside, he felt his heart race, not with fear or anger, but with a quiet, seething determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As he walked away from the private terminal, he dialed his assistant. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Cancel all upcoming flights with this airline, and start making inquiries about other companies. We're going public with this," he said, his voice low but firm. This wasn't just about one man being wronged. It was about an entire system that needed to be brought to account. He would make sure the world knew what had happened. He would make sure they would never forget his name. What Marcus didn't know, as he made his way to his car, was that the chain of events he had just set into motion would shake the foundation of the airline, expose the deep-rooted racism within its ranks, and turn the tables in a way that no one could have predicted. In the weeks that followed, as Marcus plotted his next steps, the airline began to unravel. The employees who had humiliated him would soon come to regret their actions, but not in the way they expected. What they didn't know was that Marcus Long was no ordinary man. He wasn't someone who would let an injustice go unanswered. And when they saw him again, they would understand just how much they had underestimated him. The humiliation. Jack stood a little too close to Marcus, his body language tense, as if ready to spring into action at the first sign of defiance. His eyes narrowed in suspicion, his lips tight with judgment. Behind him, Kate's smile remained fixed, a thin, smug line that made it clear this wasn't just about a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was about power. And right now, they believed they held it. Marcus knew how the game was played. It wasn't about the facts, the evidence, or the truth. It was about perception. The perception that he didn't belong. And in this moment, to them, Marcus didn't belong. He wasn't supposed to be here, in this luxurious terminal, preparing for a flight that would take him back to his penthouse and boardroom. His success was a testament to his resilience, but to these two employees, it was an anomaly. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Marcus could hear the low hum of the terminal's air conditioning, the sound of distant chatter from other travelers. But everything seemed to fade into the background as Kate turned back to the computer, typing furiously, her fingers flying over the keys. It was a deliberate act. She wanted him to feel the weight of her doubt, the burden of her scrutiny. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," Kate finally said, her voice icy, devoid of empathy. "You're causing a disruption." Marcus felt his stomach churn at the words. He had never been one to make a scene, but something in the way they spoke to him, in the way they treated him, was unbearable. They weren't just questioning his flight. They were questioning his worth. Jack, noticing the shift in Marcus's expression, seemed to grow even more confident, as if he sensed a victory within his grasp. He glanced over at Kate, then back at Marcus, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I don't know why you're even bothering. You don't have the kind of status we typically cater to." His words were casual, but they carried an underlying menace. Marcus could feel the sting of humiliation, sharp and bitter. It was not the first time he had been treated this way because of his skin color, but it always felt like a blow to the gut. He had worked his whole life to earn a place at the table, only to be reminded that some people would never let him in, no matter how much success he had achieved. As Jack continued to sneer, Marcus stood motionless, his mind racing. He was faced with a choice. Let these people strip him of his dignity in public, or make a stand, one that could cost him his flight, but perhaps teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. With a deep breath, Marcus made his decision. He calmly took a step back, pulling his phone from his pocket. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen, composing a quick email to his assistant. "Cancel the flight," he typed. "I'll need a refund and a full report on the airline's customer service. I'll be handling this personally." Kate glanced over his shoulder as she heard the soft click of his phone keys, but she didn't acknowledge it. She was too busy trying to find another excuse to make him leave. But Marcus wasn't backing down. "I'll wait for the next available flight then," he said, his voice steady, but his words cutting through the tension like a knife. His demeanor was calm, almost serene, as if he had all the time in the world. But in reality, he was calculating his next move, and it had little to do with getting on a plane. The humiliation, though bitter, would soon serve a greater purpose. The more Kate and Jack spoke down to him, the more they revealed about their own insecurities, about the system they thought they could uphold with their prejudice. They didn't realize it yet, but they were already part of the story he was about to tell. They were about to witness firsthand what it meant to underestimate a person like Marcus Long. With his phone still in his hand, Marcus stood firm. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers in the terminal turning towards him. Some curious, some uncomfortable, all witnessing the injustice that was unfolding before them. Jack's patience was wearing thin, and he was ready to escalate. "You're holding up the line," he said, his voice sharper now. "I'm not going to ask you again. Leave the premises. Now." But Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted his chin, met Jack's gaze with quiet defiance, and said, "You're not asking me to leave. You're telling me. And I don't respond to orders from people who think they can decide my worth based on the color of my skin." The room fell silent. The other passengers, who had been quietly watching the exchange, now held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. Kate and Jack exchanged a glance, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. But they quickly masked it with forced smiles, the kind of smiles that only those who are uncomfortable with their own actions put on. Marcus was still standing tall, unwavering, and his calm presence was more powerful than any confrontation. "You can have me removed," he continued, his voice steady. "But I'll make sure you'll never forget my name. I'll make sure the entire world hears about how you treated a paying customer today." Jack opened his mouth, but Marcus was already 2 steps ahead. He wasn't just going to let this slide. This wasn't about him getting on a plane. This was about standing up against the kind of systemic racism that had plagued him and so many others, a battle he knew all too well. Without waiting for a response, Marcus turned on his heel, walking towards the exit. The low murmurs of the terminal followed him as he walked with purpose, his mind already working on the next steps. As he reached the doors, he glanced back, his gaze locking with Jack's for a final moment. "You'll see," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "You'll see what happens when people like you treat people like me this way." He stepped out into the cool air, feeling the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. What they didn't know was that the game had just shifted. The power that Jack and Kate thought they had was nothing compared to the leverage Marcus now held. He had money, influence, and access to a network that could make or break businesses, and he was about to use all of it. As Marcus walked away, he knew this was just the beginning. What would happen next, no one could have predicted. But he was ready. Ready to show them that disrespecting him wasn't just a mistake, it would be their undoing. The story wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. A moment of clarity. Marcus stood there, the weight of Jack and Kate's words pressing on him, trying to break his spirit. But inside him, a different kind of strength was rising. He had fought too long, worked too hard, and sacrificed too much to let their ignorance define him. His success wasn't an accident. It was the result of relentless persistence, a vision forged through years of struggle and sacrifice. The world had tried to break him many times before, but here he was, more powerful and more focused than ever. But something deep inside him shifted in that moment. As the embarrassment and humiliation continued to pile on, a quiet voice whispered to him. Not an angry voice, not one of vengeance, but a voice of clarity, a voice that knew exactly what needed to happen next. Marcus took a slow, deliberate breath and straightened his shoulders. He would not beg for their approval. He would not justify his existence to them. Instead, he would turn this situation into something that no one in that room would ever forget. He turned to Jack, his expression cool, calm, but filled with a quiet intensity that could not be ignored. "I think you've made a mistake," he said, his voice steady, almost too calm, as if he was simply stating a fact, not an accusation. Kate looked up from the computer screen, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone dismissive but tinged with the first flicker of doubt. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, giving her time to realize the weight of his words. Then, with quiet precision, he spoke again, but this time his voice carried a different weight. "I'm the one who owns this airline," he said. Kate blinked, and Jack froze, his face flickering with disbelief. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, reverberating with the kind of impact they couldn't have expected. Their confusion was almost palpable. Marcus let the tension build before continuing, each word carefully chosen to strike with maximum effect. "This airline, the very one you're treating me like an intruder in, I own it. This terminal, my property. The planes you operate, mine too. The contracts you are so carefully examining, doubting every second of my existence because of the color of my skin, they're signed with my name at the bottom. You've been humiliating the man who could have been your boss." The shock on their faces was immediate. Kate's mouth parted in surprise, her eyes widening as she glanced from the computer screen back to Marcus, as if she couldn't quite process what he was saying. Jack, on the other hand, looked like he might collapse under the weight of his own arrogance. "I'm going to say this once," Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. "You will never, ever treat another human being like this again. Not on my watch." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Kate shifted her weight, and Jack took an involuntary step back, his face pale. But Marcus wasn't finished. "What's worse," he said, his voice hardening, "is that this isn't the first time you've done this. You've turned away people based on their skin color before, haven't you? You've seen them, wealthy, successful people, and dismissed them the moment they walked through that door. You've reduced them to stereotypes, to nothing more than the color of their skin, and you've made judgments without even trying to understand who they truly are." Kate's face reddened as she opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus cut her off. "You didn't just treat me like an outsider. You treated me like I didn't belong in a world that I built for myself. And that is not something you will get away with." A few moments passed, and for the first time since he'd walked into that terminal, Marcus saw fear in their eyes. Not fear for their safety or for any physical threat. No, it was a deeper, more primal fear. The fear of the unknown. The fear of facing the consequences of their actions. The fear of realizing that their world, their comfortable and discriminatory world, was about to crumble under the weight of their own ignorance. Marcus smiled, not out of malice, but out of resolve. "I'm not here to destroy you, but I will make sure that you never treat anyone like this again. Not under my name. Not in my company." With that, he turned on his heel, striding toward the door. But as he reached the threshold, he paused, looking over his shoulder one last time. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers soon. I'm sure you'll find that my decision to terminate your employment will be very educational." Jack and Kate stood frozen, their faces pale and mouths agape. But Marcus didn't need to see their reactions. He knew that they had just realized the enormity of their mistake. As Marcus stepped out into the bright sunshine of the parking lot, he felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about getting revenge. This wasn't about showing them that he could destroy their careers. No, this was about something far greater, teaching them a lesson they would never forget. It was about showing them that no matter how much power they thought they had, no matter how deeply they believed in their superiority, there was a cost to their prejudice. And that cost would be steep. Marcus Long had always known that success wasn't just about making money. It was about using that success to make a difference. He had built his empire with the belief that no one should ever feel inferior because of where they came from, what they looked like, or who they were. Today, he had taken the first step in showing the world just how far he was willing to go to make that belief a reality. But little did Jack and Kate know, this was only the beginning. The shockwave that Marcus had just sent through their lives would ripple out in ways they could never have anticipated. They hadn't just lost their jobs. They had lost their place in a world they thought was theirs to control. And now Marcus would make sure that the world they had tried to keep so neatly divided would be turned upside down, one decision at a time. The reckoning. The word hung in the air, and for a long, agonizing moment, neither Jack nor Kate spoke. The silence between them felt suffocating, as though the very foundations of the terminal were trembling in the wake of Marcus's revelation. The confident, self-assured expressions on their faces faltered, their eyes flickering between one another, trying to process what they had just heard. But no matter how much they tried to dismiss it, they couldn't escape the truth. Marcus Long wasn't just a passenger on their flight. He was the force that had created everything they stood on, the one who had made it all possible. And in that moment, they had underestimated him, not just as a man, but as the very architect of the system they worked for. Jack's face was flushed with embarrassment, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to find words that didn't seem utterly foolish. Kate, too, seemed stunned, her eyes wide as she quickly glanced over at Jack, then back to Marcus, as if she were waiting for him to laugh and reveal it was all some elaborate prank. But Marcus didn't smile. He didn't laugh. There was no satisfaction in this for him, no gloating or triumph. Instead, what he saw in their eyes, their growing recognition, was the beginning of something far more significant. This wasn't about him winning a petty argument. This was about the power of recognition, about showing them that they could not define him, no matter how much they tried to reduce him to stereotypes or assumptions. He had spent his life proving the world wrong, and this moment, this confrontation, was just another opportunity to remind them all that success was not dictated by the color of one's skin, nor by the judgment of small minds. Marcus took another steady breath, his voice soft, but piercing through the tension like a blade through cloth. "I understand why you might have thought differently," he said, his tone carrying a quiet authority. "After all, in a world where people like me are often pushed to the edges, it's easy to think that the wealth I've earned is somehow out of place, that the suit, the watch, the polished shoes are just the trappings of a lucky person. But the truth is, I've spent my life building something that you will never understand until you take a moment to see beyond your assumptions." For the first time, Kate and Jack stopped their nervous shifting and actually listened. They stared at him, not with suspicion now, but with the kind of wariness one would reserve for a man who suddenly held all the cards in his hand. Marcus could feel the moment turning. There was no turning back now. "I didn't come here today to make you feel small," Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. "But I won't allow anyone to degrade me, to question my worth, or to treat me as less than because of the skin I was born into. And I certainly won't let anyone, no matter how much power they think they have in this building, make me feel like an intruder in my own life." Kate looked down at the computer screen again, but the act seemed mechanical now, as if she were grasping at some shred of professionalism to shield herself from the reality Marcus had just laid bare before them. Jack, meanwhile, opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words got caught in his throat. He had nothing to say. What could he say? What could anyone say when confronted with their own ignorance, their own arrogance, laid bare for all to see? Marcus waited a beat, allowing the weight of his words to settle in. He wasn't done. Not yet. "Your behavior, both of you, was unprofessional," Marcus said, his tone not angry, but cold, precise. "It was also deeply rooted in prejudice. And that, I'm afraid, is something I cannot let slide, not in a world where I've fought for every ounce of my success, every inch of my worth." For a moment, it seemed as if the world had paused. The soft hum of the terminal's air conditioning, the low murmur of distant voices, everything seemed to fade into the background as Marcus's words echoed through the room, impossible to ignore. But then, as if snapping out of a trance, Kate looked up again, her expression shifting, her composure faltering. You can't just threaten us like this," she stammered, but even her voice was shaky, the calm front she had put up dissolving. "We didn't know." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Marcus interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. "You didn't know. You assumed. You judged me based on what you saw, not on who I am. And that assumption cost you everything." Kate's face drained of color as she realized where this was headed. Jack's shoulders slumped in defeat. They both understood now that the game had changed. Marcus wasn't just some random business traveler. He was the one holding the reins, the one with the power to change everything. Without waiting for them to respond, Marcus turned his back on them. He didn't need to waste another word. He had made his point. They had learned their lesson, and it was one that would stick with them for a very long time. But just as Marcus reached the door to exit, a thought occurred to him. One final act that would ensure they'd remember him long after he was gone. He stopped and turned back to face them, the flicker of his eyes a reminder of everything that had just transpired. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," Marcus said, his words slow and deliberate. "As of today, I'm making sure that your company is held accountable for the actions of your employees, for the discrimination, for the humiliation, for everything you thought you could get away with because you assumed you were untouchable. You're not. No one is." And with that, Marcus walked out, leaving Jack and Kate to process not only the shocking reality of his ownership, but the fact that their careers were now hanging by a thread. As he stepped into his private car waiting outside, Marcus could feel the weight of everything that had just unfolded settling in his chest. But there was no anger, no bitterness. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction, because he had done more than just defend himself. He had turned the tables, showing them that no one could ever strip away his dignity. His worth was his own, and he would no longer allow anyone to make him feel small. The next few weeks would be a whirlwind. Lawyers, media attention, corporate meetings, but Marcus was ready for all of it. He had fought for his success, and now he was ready to fight for what was right. This was only the beginning. And the reckoning, as it turned out, wasn't just for Jack and Kate. It was for everyone who ever believed that skin color or status could define someone's potential. Marcus Long was not just a man. He was a force. The consequences of underestimating Marcus Long. Marcus let his words hang in the air, the silence in the terminal thickening around them. Jack and Kate stood frozen, their faces now betraying an uncomfortable mix of disbelief and growing panic. The reality of the situation was setting in, and Marcus could see the shift. They were no longer looking at him as just another black man with a wallet full of credit cards. They were looking at him as the owner of the very empire that had humiliated them, a man who had the power to upend their lives in the blink of an eye. For a long while, Marcus said nothing. The calm in his demeanor was disorienting to them. If he were angry, they could dismiss him as a difficult customer. If he were upset, they could brush him off as an emotional person overreacting. But he wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional. He was simply, unmistakably, the one in control. The realization began to creep into their minds slowly at first, but as the seconds passed, it became undeniable. Jack's face had gone pale, the flush of embarrassment now replaced by fear. Kate, trying to regain some semblance of composure, cleared her throat and stammered, I'm sorry. Sir, I didn't realize. But the words fell flat, hollow, and rehearsed, as if she was trying to salvage something that was already lost. Marcus gave them no quarter. I'm not interested in your apology, he said, his voice colder than before. What I am interested in is your acknowledgement that this behavior, this assumption, is not just offensive. It's systemic. It's part of a larger issue that's been ingrained in this company for years. You looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong. Someone you could humiliate because of the way I look, because of what you assumed about my background. He took a deliberate step forward, letting the weight of his words sink in. And you did it without hesitation, without even questioning it. The last statement hung heavy in the air, piercing through the uncomfortable atmosphere like an accusation too loud to ignore. Jack shifted uneasily on his feet, unable to meet Marcus's eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. Kate, still trying to recover, found herself trapped by Marcus's gaze, unable to look away. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and the confidence that had once oozed from their faces was now replaced by a palpable fear of the consequences. But Marcus wasn't interested in their fear. That would be easy, too easy. Instead, he chose to educate them, to expose the depths of their ignorance. He understood that fear would only breed more fear. He wanted to show them, force them to see that the system they relied on, where people like him were pushed to the margins, was built on fragile foundations. It could crumble in an instant, just as easily as their world had shifted beneath their feet. I don't want your apology, Kate, Marcus continued, his voice now a quiet thunder, because it's hollow. I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember how quickly you judged me. And I want you to think about all the people you've done this to in the past. All the times you assumed someone wasn't worthy simply because they didn't fit the mold you were used to. You've been complicit in a system that treats people based on the color of their skin and not the content of their character. You need to understand that. The words hung in the air, each syllable weighted with truth. Jack and Kate were now visibly shaken, but it wasn't the fear of Marcus that was haunting them. It was the realization that they had been part of something much larger, something insidious that they had never even questioned. They had just assumed that their roles as gatekeepers, as people who knew their place, gave them the right to decide who was worthy of respect and who was not. Marcus was done talking. He had made his point. He didn't need to continue down the path of their humiliation. The damage had been done, and they knew it. With a deliberate movement, Marcus turned and began walking toward the exit. But just before he reached the door, he paused and turned back one last time, his back straight, his voice carrying the final blow. You'll be hearing from my lawyers, he said, his tone now final, devoid of any emotion. Not because I'm angry, not because I want revenge, but because this behavior is not acceptable. You have no idea who I am, but you will. And the next time you decide to make assumptions based on the color of someone's skin, you'll remember this day, because it will be the day you realize that your power is fragile, and you're not the ones in control anymore. As Marcus walked out of the terminal, leaving Jack and Kate behind, the weight of the moment continued to echo through the building. The terminal, once a symbol of their authority and privilege, now felt like a house of cards, precariously perched on the brink of collapse. And just like that, the world had shifted again. Only this time, it wasn't Marcus who had to prove himself. It was them. They were the ones who had been forced to confront their own ignorance, their own biases, and the undeniable fact that they were living in a world that was no longer going to accept their small-mindedness. For Marcus Long, this was just another battle won, another chapter in his journey of triumph over adversity. But for Jack and Kate, it was a moment of reckoning, one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives.